Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. Economist John Friedman has made a career researching the causes of inequality and its long-term consequences for children in the US. His findings are grim. Social mobility is in sharp decline. Where you live and go to school increasingly determines your success and future. In his 2024 session, The Fading Dream, Friedman explores how policy can harness schools, universities, neighbourhoods and social capital to reverse this trend and revive upward mobility, and what this could mean in a country like Australia.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for a very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming to spend your afternoon here with us today. I'm going to talk about the fact that it has become increasingly difficult in many modern societies for children to have the dream of upward mobility. And this is not just something that we feel by looking around. It is not just something that we feel intuitively. It's something that we see very clearly in the data. So, how do we see this? Well, think about a very simple way to conceive of intergenerational mobility for children. It's the dream that through hard work, someone can rise up and achieve a standard of living that's better one generation on than their parents lived in a generation before. How are we doing as a society in offering children this possibility? Well, we can actually measure this in data. And what we find, first here starting in the United States, is that it's been a fading dream over time. Each dot that I'm showing you here is just a very simple statistic. It asks what share of children born in each year grew up to achieve intergenerational mobility by that very simple measure, to have a higher standard of living than his or her parents. For children born in the 1940s and 50s, it was nearly a guarantee. 90% of children achieved upward mobility by this definition. But you see, as we move from the left over to the right, as we get towards more recent cohorts, I was actually born in the last dot over here in 1980, where my cohort had little better than a coin flip chance of achieving intergenerational mobility in this way. Now, this is a particular problem, I think, in the United States, but it's a problem that's also shared by many, many societies across the world, Australia included. So if we do the same calculation for Australia in the yellow series here, things haven't quite fallen as far as fast, but still we see that a child's chance of achieving intergenerational mobility today look nothing like what they looked a generation ago. What I want to now do over the next hour in our session is to try to unpack what's going on here. And the tool I'm going to use to do that is big data. Big data is going to help us understand what are the important dimensions of upward mobility. What is it that helps children escape a cycle of poverty? And what does that tell us about how we should shape policy in government, in our educational institutions, in the private sector, how we can try to reverse this decline? The first thing that we can learn from big data is simply the vast extent to which the circumstances of your birth matter for your chances of achieving intergenerational mobility in this way. there's a lot of attention, rightly so, focused on racial and ethnic disparities in upward mobility. But what we see in the data is that it does not stop there. There are enormous disparities by socioeconomic class, and even enormous disparities simply depending on the neighborhood where you grow up. So this map of the United States here is what we call the Opportunity Atlas. It's a map of what parts of the country children who grow up in poverty have of succeeding in escaping poverty as an adult. The deep red areas are areas where, on average, children remain in poverty, and they are trapped in that intergenerational cycle of poverty. The blue areas are the areas where, when children grow up, they have much, much better odds. And it's not just about growing up in one part of the country or another. This is actually a very local phenomenon. So rather than looking at it across the entire United States, we can use the data to look at it literally neighborhood by neighborhood. In almost any city, you'll see this same level of variation. So here is a map of New York City. The blue is the same blue as it was on the national map, very high levels of intergenerational mobility. Red is the same, very low levels where children are stuck in an intergenerational cycle of poverty. But here, it's not about going halfway across the country. In often case, it is literally about going from one side of the street to another, going from one block to the next. And this too is not a problem or a set of circumstances is unique to the United States. We see here in Australia the same type of regional disparities in intergenerational mobility. So this map is colored a little bit differently. The deeper red areas are still those areas with the lowest levels of mobility, and just the lighter the colors get, the greater the mobility. There are the same type of very large disparities between regions. And again, even locally, you can go 5 miles in different directions from where we're sitting right here today and find some of the highest mobility neighborhoods and some of the lowest mobility neighborhoods in the entire country. Now, this is a huge problem. There is, I think, almost nothing more fundamental to our concept of what a fair society is than the notion that a child's opportunities in life should not be circumscribed by the arbitrary circumstances of his or her birth. And so the fact that this type of enormous disparity exists is not just an economic problem, but it's a social problem, and it actually, I think, lies at the root of a lot of the political divisiveness that's arisen in so many societies in recent years. And while big data is helpful in revealing the nature of the problem, it's also now going to be helpful in solving the problem. Because we can ask, what is it that seems to be going right in those communities that offer high levels of mobility? And what can we then take to improve mobility in those communities that currently lack it? So let me go back to the United States map, and we simply want to ask, what's going right in the blue areas, and what seems to not be going right in the... Now, when I talk about this, many people's first instinct is that it's just all about economic growth. If we can have a local economy that's growing, that's providing lots of jobs, lots of high-paying jobs, then upward mobility for children and opportunity will take care of itself. And so we can look at that in the data. We can ask, are the American cities that have experienced the largest growth in the economies over the period where these children were growing up, are those the places where we've seen the most opportunities and upward mobility for children who are born into poverty? And the answer is no. Here we can just, for the largest 30 cities in the country, we can look to see, are cities that are further out here on the right that have grown fastest over this period, are they the cities that have provided the best opportunity for children growing up in poverty? And you see that it's simply not the case. Why isn't it the case? It's because in places like Charlotte and Atlanta, which have been just booming economically, that growth has not been equally distributed, and it has largely passed by the communities of children and then young adults who one is trying to help. So if it's not the local economy, what is it? And what we find in the data is that it's not just about having jobs around, it's about the tight community in which these children grow up that people are working and engaged. So one of the most strongly associated factors that we see connected with upward mobility at the local level is lower poverty rates. Right? It's not about the jobs, it's about the employed people that help shape the fabric of the community. And it's about this in a way that is incredibly local. You should not think about what's happening on roughly your side of the city or even in your broad neighborhood. Think about what's happening in an incredibly small radius around where a child grows up. In the data, if you start by looking at how poverty rates connect with upward mobility, start on the very block where a child lives. And then ask, how much less connected are poverty rates one block over? Another block over, another block over, and you see that by the time you are more than a kilometer away, there's just no connection anymore. This is incredibly local. And so that tells us that we have to think about these things on a very, very local basis. What else is connected with mobility? Well, in addition to poverty rates, we see that more stable families in a community are very strongly associated with mobility. And again, the key thing here is the community. So take a child who's growing up in whatever household. It's of course important what that child's household looks like, but this is about what the households around that child look like. That is another incredibly important factor. High quality schools are a factor, but in fact, by far the most important factor is social capital, the level of connectedness that we see within a community. And I think that makes sense because even when we look at poverty rates or we look at households, that too, it's about the fabric of a community. And social capital is going to be one of the most direct ways of measuring that. Just to give you a sense of how tightly these things are linked, think about the map that I showed you before that's on the left. That's the areas in blue where mobility is the highest, and in red where intergenerational mobility is the lowest. If we construct a similar map for social capital, it looks almost identical. The areas where there is more connectedness, where there are children who grow up in an integrated community as opposed to isolated in islands of poverty, that is the most important factor that we see in the data to describe a situation that offers upward mobility. So how is it that these type of connections come about? Well, part of it is just about segregation, but social capital is important in so many other ways. And it, in fact, explains much of the ways in which things like poverty rates and stable households connect with mobility themselves. So think about all the different communities in the United States. The places that have more social capital are also the places that have higher incomes, that have lower poverty. And we can ask, which of the two connects more closely with mobility by coloring in these dots according to those same colors on the map, right? Blue are the same very high mobility places. The red dots are these places that offer very low levels of mobility. And what you see here, there are these bands of colors that go across the graph. What does that mean? It means if you take a given community at a given level of poverty and income, and you ask, what happens when you add more social capital, but don't change the underlying economics? The households go from red to yellow to green to blue. And the opportunities for children grow. But if we go the other way on the graph, if we only change what's going on economically without providing any more connection, without providing any more social capital, that's what happens if we go across the graph here. It really makes no difference. And so while that underlying economic situation is, of course, important, it's all being driven by those levels of connection and social capital. Now, part of social capital is just about isolation. Part of it comes about through the segregation of neighborhoods and schools, right? Because if you're living in a neighborhood or in a school that's isolated, you're not going to be able to make those connections. But too often in the data, what we find is that neighborhoods or schools which are notionally integrated do not, in fact, bring more social capital. Why is that? It's because just getting people to be physically in the same place is not enough. Because even if we integrate schools, for instance, if the children are not interacting with each other across social divisions, then you're not achieving your goal. In fact, if you look back at some of what were the most famously integrated schools in the United States, they were notionally integrated, but they were not functionally integrated. You had one set of children taking one set of classes on one floor and another set of children taking classes on a different floor. And you ended up with a situation like we see over here, where even though everyone's in the same school, you're not forming those connections. So what can we take from this? What can we take from the data to help us craft policies that will actually improve and restore that dream of mobility? Well, the data really point to three different approaches, all motivated here by the importance of connection and social capital. The first approach really tries to directly address these problems by reducing segregation. We know from what I just told you that that's not necessarily enough, but if people aren't in the same place, then that makes it so much harder. And unfortunately, what we see is that many neighborhoods have self-reinforcing aspects of segregation. Families living in poverty often will remain inside that isolated island because the barriers to moving out, both the notional barriers and sometimes the literal barriers, are too much. And so how can we address this? By empowering families, by trying to sweep away those barriers. Sometimes it comes through overt or implicit discrimination, but often it comes simply through the challenge of moving into what is an unknown neighborhood while at the same time trying to put enough food on the table to feed your family. And what we found is that by supporting families as they make their choice, you can help to break down these barriers and help families live in a way where they are themselves choosing to live in much more integrated communities. And by there, you can tap, this doesn't have to be a top-down thing. You empower a grassroots movement to increase connection and reduce segregation. That has its limits though, right? We're not going to fix low opportunity neighborhoods and islands of poverty simply by enabling people to move out. And so the second set of policies that these data really point to are ways to invest in very low mobility places. But the data tell us what types of investments we need to make. It's investments in the community. It's investments to help create connection. It's investments that support families and children. And sometimes that takes the form of more kind of physical plant stuff, but oftentimes it revolves more around supporting families and supporting children. So, for instance, sweeping away the types of limitations on supports that can be provided can be incredibly powerful in a way that simply building nice new apartment buildings will not. A third way that we've seen to be incredibly powerful focuses on a new type of community that young adults begin to enter into once they leave the household at age 18 or 20, and that's the role of higher education and workforce training. We, of course, connect universities and other continuing education with upward mobility, but too often we don't recognize the importance of those institutions not simply as purveyors of skills, but as another form of community, and one which in fact is often less beholden to the constraints and the barriers that shape our neighborhoods. And so when done in the best way, universities provide that type of integrated community where children not only get the skills they need in the classroom, but they also go into the network of their fellow students that is also incredibly important. Now, people associate this less with workforce training, but the most successful workforce training programs have been those that focus not only on teaching skills, but also on giving that broader set of social capital and connections. And not just on creating those connections, but giving young adults those soft sense of what you need to do, how to construct a resume, how to go into a job interview that people who come from some backgrounds just get naturally, but it's too often missing in other contexts. I want to close by talking about not just the types of specific policies that we can do, but again, returning to the broad imperative of increasing mobility for our societies. I think the moral case for this is clear. The value to the children whose opportunities are now expanded is without doubt. But these are a set of changes that can actually go in a far broader way to benefit all of society. And that's because when you offer children the opportunity to become the best that they can be, it helps us all. Now, let me give you an example, I hope will really bring this home. Think about individuals who work in creative ways that benefit us all. There are lots of different professions that look like that. Inventors, I think, are one particular segment. People who create in ways that drive growth. And you can measure that. What's nice is by the patents that come along with those inventions. And like so many other aspects of society that we've talked about so far today, the children who grow up to create those patents disproportionately come from advantaged families. And there are disparities in all the same ways that we've talked about, but just to highlight one, children who come from the very top of the income distribution are 10 times more likely to grow up to have a patent than children from the bottom half of the income distribution. And what's amazing is this is not just about education. Of course, that's an important part of it. But even if you look among the children who all, let's say, get the very highest math scores, right? These are the people who you think we really want children with this extraordinary level of talent from all backgrounds to be able to contribute to society in this way. You see that those top-scoring children from low-income families are 3 times less likely to grow up to have a patent than those same high-scoring children, but if only they're from high-income families. And in fact, if you were to sweep away all of these barriers, if you were to even the rates of patenting by class, by race and ethnicity, by gender, you would quadruple the amount of innovation that happens in a society. And right, this is just one particular way in which allowing for opportunity for all is something that does not just benefit us morally, it does not just have individual benefits, but it is something that brings incredibly broad-based benefits for all of us. Thank you very much.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.